Apple has never put a variable aperture on an iPhone, not once, not on the 15 Pro, not on the 16 Pro, not on the 17 Pro. Every single year, that main camera has been locked, fixed aperture, no exceptions. Until now, Apple has started ramping up its supply chain for a new variable aperture camera system expected to debut in the iPhone 18 Pro and Pro Max this September. And here's what's wild. Production has already started. Like right now, parts are being made. This thing is happening. But before you lose your mind, I need to tell you something that almost nobody covering this story is saying out loud, because this feature, it's either going to change iPhone photography forever, or it's going to be the most overhyped spec drop Apple has ever pulled. And by the end of this video, you'll know exactly which one it is. So here's what we're actually dealing with. The main 48 megapixel Fusion camera on both iPhone 18 Pro models is rumored to have a variable aperture, which would allow users to control the amount of light that passes through the camera's lens and reaches the sensor. That's the headline everyone's running with. But the supply chain news that dropped today is what makes this feel real. Apple's component suppliers are beginning production for iPhone 18 parts, and a new report says this includes elements of a brand new camera feature for the iPhone 18 Pro. I've been tracking iPhone camera leaks for years, and the difference between a rumor and a done deal is usually this exact moment, when suppliers start cutting parts. That's where we are. And there's one specific detail in this story that actually made me stop and go, wait, hold on, we'll get there. Okay, quick level set. Because half the comments on every article about this are people who don't fully understand what variable aperture means. And that's not a dig. It's genuinely confusing when you've never shot on a real camera. From the iPhone 14 Pro through the iPhone 17 Pro, the main camera uses a fixed aperture, meaning the lens remains fully open at all times when capturing images. In contrast, a variable aperture lets the camera control how much light reaches the sensor. In low light conditions, it opens to admit more light, while in bright scenes, it closes to avoid overexposure. Think of it like your eye. When you walk into a dark room, your pupil gets huge. Walk outside into sunshine, it shrinks down. Your eye does this automatically every second of the day. iPhones couldn't do that. The lens was just stuck, wide open all the time. This should also give users more control over depth of field. And that's the part that matters for photography. More control means more creative options. But here's where I want to pump the brakes slightly, because it's important not to expect too much from a variable aperture. iPhone cameras already have very wide apertures, but don't offer very shallow depth of field because the sensor is just too small, right? The physics of it. A small sensor is a small sensor. You can give it a variable aperture and it's still not going to produce the buttery background blur you get from a full-frame mirrorless camera. That gap exists, and it doesn't disappear because Apple added a mechanical iris. But here's what a variable aperture does really well. It is possible to close the aperture to achieve a greater depth of field, for example, to get a sharp image of everyone in a group photo. That one actually matters in real life. We've all been there. Group photo, someone's blurry. Portrait mode tried its best. Computational photography did what it could. But a real physical depth of field adjustment, that's different. That's not software pretending. That's optics doing actual work. And then there's video. For capturing video in very bright light conditions, it's advantageous to close down the aperture to get longer exposure times per picture frame and thereby introduce motion blur for the cinematic effect. If you've ever tried to shoot cinematic video in harsh sunlight on an iPhone and ended up with footage that looks weirdly sharp and clinical, and this is the fix for that, genuinely. So it's not a gimmick, but it's also not magic. It's a tool. And how useful that tool is depends entirely on how Apple lets you use it. Here's the thing about iPhone rumors. Variable aperture has been rumored for like 3 years. 3 years, every cycle, someone says it's coming. Every cycle, it doesn't show up. In December 2024, Apple supply chain analyst Ming-Chi Kuo was first to say that the main rear camera on both iPhone 18 Pro models will offer variable aperture. A report from October 2025 said Apple was moving ahead with plans to bring the technology to next generation iPhones and was discussing components with suppliers. But today's news is different because today's news isn't about Apple talking to suppliers. It's about suppliers actually making parts. China's Sunny Optical has already started producing the actuators that enable the aperture mechanism, and camera module assembly by LG Innotek, Apple's primary camera partner, is set to follow in early summer around June or July, with dedicated equipment being physically installed at its Gumi facility in South Korea. Dedicated equipment being physically installed at a specific factory in a specific city. That's not a rumor, that's a procurement decision. That's millions of dollars of capital expenditure. Apple doesn't do that for features they're not shipping. LG Innotek is reportedly likely to take on a larger share of production for the main camera module due to the system's added complexity. A similar thing happened when Apple adopted a folded tetraprism zoom lens in the iPhone 15 Pro Max, where LG Innotek initially served as the sole supplier. So this is actually following a very specific Apple playbook. New complex camera tech, LG Innotek heavy lifting, eventual multi-supplier expansion. We've seen this movie before, we know how it ends. While the camera is obviously the headliner here, let's talk about the rest of what's reportedly coming, because context matters when you're deciding whether this is worth upgrading for. Supply chain leaks and analyst reports are pointing to a variable aperture camera system, a powerful 2nm 820 Pro chip, significantly larger batteries, and a noticeably smaller dynamic island as the devices head toward a September 2026 launch. At the heart of the iPhone 18 Pro lies the 820 Pro chip, built on TSMC's advanced 2nm process. Faster performance, better energy efficiency, seamless multitasking. The whole deal. At least one of the iPhone 18 Pro models could also feature a new 3-layer stacked image sensor developed by Samsung. That means a more responsive camera, less noise, better dynamic range, and more room to work with in tricky lighting conditions. And for selfies, the front-facing camera gets bumped up to 24 megapixels, up from 18, which honestly, for video calls alone, long overdue. Now, there's one more thing I need to flag. Mark Gurman has noted that the Pro model isn't likely to be the star of Apple's iPhone launch this fall. That spotlight is going to the company's very first foldable phone. The foldable iPhone is expected to include a 7.8-inch inner display and a 5.5-inch outer display, and it's going to eat all the oxygen in the room when Apple announces it. The 18 Pro has to carry its own weight, and honestly, the variable aperture camera might be the one thing that lets it do that. Okay, here's where I'm at. Many rumors describe the iPhone 18 Pro as an S-year style update, evolutionary rather than revolutionary, focusing on refining existing strengths. And that's true. If you're on the 17 Pro, this is probably a skip. You're getting the same sensor size, the same general design, a marginally better chip, and a camera feature that, while genuinely new, is going to be limited by small sensor physics, regardless of how elegant the implementation is. But if you're on anything 15 Pro or older, the combination of variable aperture photography, record battery capacity, and a more advanced chip could make it one of the most compelling upgrades in recent cycles, especially if you care about camera versatility and all-day endurance. And here's where I land on the variable aperture specifically. For photographers who know their way around a lens, they will likely have a lot of fun playing with depth of field. But for most people who don't know what an aperture is, will Apple use AI and computer vision to set it automatically? That question right there is the entire ballgame. If Apple locks this behind a pro setting that casual users never touch, it becomes a spec sheet win and a real world footnote. If they build it into the camera's intelligence so it's working for everyone without them even knowing, then this genuinely upgrades every photo every user takes every single day. That's the version I'm hoping for. That's the version that justifies the upgrade. So, where do we land? The iPhone 18 Pro variable aperture camera is real. Production has started. The supply chain is moving. This is not a rumor anymore. It's a product being built. Whether it's transformative or just impressive depends entirely on Apple's software execution. The hardware is novel. The physics are what they are. But Apple's track record of making complex camera technology feel effortless, portrait mode, photonic engine, cinematic mode, gives me genuine optimism here. My honest take, if you're upgrading this fall, this is the one feature that will actually change how your photos feel. Not the chip, not the dynamic island, the aperture. Because for the first time, your iPhone camera will be able to adapt to the world the same way your eye does. And if Apple somehow finds a way to explain variable aperture to a general audience without ever using the word aperture, then that's when you know they've really figured it out. I'm genuinely curious. Are you upgrading for the camera, waiting for the fold, or skipping this cycle entirely? Let me know below, because next week I'm going deep on the iPhone Fold, and your answer might change your mind about both. See you next one. Peace.